Digital Audio Health by Symatrax.
Welcome to the Rhonda Grant Show with your host, Rhonda Grant. If you believe that there is more to life than what you see right now and you want to find out more, listen in as her guests share their journey and their extraordinary experiences. Now, here is your host, Rhonda Grant.
Welcome to the Rhonda Grant Show. Sometimes the universe has a way of placing people or obstacles in your path to help guide and direct you on your mission. Listen in as we discover the path my guest has traveled. Has he been inspired by a calling, crafted his journey, or a bit of both? I invite you to embrace the conversation and to use it to help you to recognize if this is happening in your life. Our guest today is Staff Sergeant Jason Kyle, who is a career soldier and combat veteran in the U.S. Army. He is a single father and hopefully a career writer. His new book, Honor Lost, received the Plume Award. Welcome to the Rhonda Grant Show, Jason.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's really nice to see you and talk again. Can you let our audience know, where did you grow up and what inspired you to write this novel that you're publishing, Honor Lost?
So I grew up in an Air Force family. So I've lived all over the place. As far as what inspired me, I guess the ending of Return of the King, honestly. I was watching it one day while I was in Iraq, and a question just kind of popped into my head. I wonder what would have happened to this world if Sauron, the bad guy, had won. And I came to two conclusions. Well, either the world would end a la Warhammer End Times style, where the world just kind of implodes on itself, or more realistically, I think he would just take over and rule with an iron fist. So I went that route, and then I started kind of stream of consciousness style, started thinking, okay, well, if the bad guy won and he decided to rule, what kind of people would that create? What kind of cultures would that create? Where would the line of morality be? Like, what would people consider good and evil and stuff like that? And I kind of decided it would be a pretty bleak world where the really, really good guys are just simply people who don't go out of their way to do evil.
Right.
And where evil and depravity would be kind of commonplace, especially in the ruling class.
And so did that inspire you to begin to write your novel?
It did. I started world building in my head as I would do radio guard duties and go on convoys. I had a lot of time by myself to just brainstorm in between patrols and some of that. And I would just brainstorm. And one day, after I'd been doing this for a couple of weeks, I started just kind of doing these bubble charts. Like, okay, here's what I've thought about the world. Here's some of the characters that I've thought about. Here's what some of my influences. Okay, what would this evil empire look like? Well, maybe a little bit Roman, a little Nazi German, a little Russian, a little this, a little that. What would the good guys, so-called good guys, look like, and some of that. And before I know it, I had a whole notebook full of short biographies on characters and some of that. And I was like, okay, yeah, I've got enough content. I think let me start writing and see where this goes. And a little over a year later, I ended up with like 230,000 words.
Wow.
Yeah.
But you were very strategic about it. I mean, you developed a map so that a reader like myself can refer to that map when you are describing certain scenes or when the soldiers are moving from one place to the other. Fantastic.
Yes. Well, I mean, for one, I'm a planner anyway. That's my nature. I don't do things very spontaneously. Most of the time, I think things through quite a bit. Maybe I've been accused by my supervisors even of overthinking things at times. But funny thing about the map, that actually came at the very, very end. I had in my head, I was loosely imagining the eastern half of the US for most of my story. So having spent 20 years in the Army, I understand logistics. I understand how far soldiers can march in a day. I understand how wearing body armor affects you and stuff like that in ways that that civilian writers don't seem to, based on all the books that I've read where they maybe cover similar events, and they don't cover little things like, here's a massive army marching for weeks on end to get from point A to point B. How are they eating? You know?
Yeah.
Little things like that civilian writers just don't seem to cover. And my military mind thinks about that constantly. The logistics side of that. How are they getting resupplied? Stuff
Fantastic.
like that. So the map actually came at the very, very end where I was like, okay, my story needs a map. I started using some map building software, some cheap map building software. Finally created my map. I found a way to overlay it with a grid system, which I was thrilled with, because that once I could scale how big the grids were, and that allowed me to put an actual scale on it. So I turned my location into basically an island. Roughly, I'd have to recheck my notes, but off the top of my head, I made the island roughly the size of Australia. So an island, but a really, really big one.
Yeah.
And it still ended up, I think Australia actually is still square mileage wise about the same size as the eastern portion of the US. So I didn't have to do too much reworking, but once I did make a 2-scale map, I then went and skimmed back through my book once again and made sure that every time I had soldiers moving from point A to point B to point C, etc., that it lined up with my map. Like, okay, could they have covered this distance? And in a few instances, I did have to alter how long it took, or I had to alter how far they actually marched because it didn't line up with my map.
And so, I mean, you go into quite a bit of detail of what the soldiers are wearing on either sides. And so did you do some illustrating as you were also creating your book?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm a total nerd for armor and weapons and stuff like that.
Yes.
So yeah, I did some sketches myself while I was writing just to keep myself consistent. So I knew how to describe, because weapons and stuff like that influence your tactics. So I had to design like the Untvesky army. Okay, they're an army primarily of conscripts, which means they don't need really expensive, elaborate gear, but they are uniformed. So that made me kind of think Roman style armor, because that was one of the first early armors that had, for their day, Roman soldiers were actually very heavily armored for their day. So originally I had envisioned the Untvesky looking very Roman. And then when it came time to professionally publish Honor Lost through Writers Republic, I decided to get an artist that I found on Etsy to do some illustrations better than what I could do based on the sketches that I had done. And when I was providing her with examples of what I was wanting these people to look like, I stumbled across some 12th century Russian soldiers, Hussars, I think. I can't remember what that type of troop is actually called, but they're wearing Lamalar, scaled armor. And I saw that and I was just like, ooh, that looks really, really cool.
Yeah.
So on a dime, I changed the way the Untvesky looked, and that actually even made me go back through my novel and change out a few descriptions as to what they looked like, because originally I had written them looking somewhere between Roman and Norman soldiers of the 11th century with a lot of chainmail, simple cone helmets, still using kite shields or tower shields. I don't think I specified exactly the shape of the shield, but they do use big shields because armies that fight in shoulder to shoulder formations tend to use the big shields. And that's how that was the style of combat that I used for the Unveski, a very, very simple kind of style that doesn't necessarily require extensive training.
Mm-hmm. And so you had a lot of free time and you spent it creating this book and writing this book. Did a lot of people who were in the army do that, or?
No,
they didn't.
I am very, very odd in comparison. Most soldiers, between doing their duties, most soldiers hit the gym. They go out bar hopping. Sometimes they go out and play sports, play around on motorcycles and what have you.
It's the same as regular life. It's the same as regular life, right? I mean, there's some people who use their spare time in creativity, and then others who spend it doing other things, whether they're positive or negative, right? So that's kind of interesting. So where are you headed with this book? I mean, is it released at this point?
So, I mean, it's released on Amazon. It's released on Writers Republic. My mom actually just the other day said that she got a copy from Barnes and Noble. So I know those three sources, and you can get it either online or you can get a hard copy. At some point in the very near future, it will be coming out across select states around the U.S. in paperback. Last time I talked to Writers Republic, they were still talking to these bookstore owners, finding out who's willing to buy copies of my book to put them in their stores. Mm-hmm. That should be happening. I should actually probably give them a call this week if I don't hear from them soon. It should be soon that it'll be available in a lot of bookstores.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, people can go to Amazon and look up Honor Lost by Jason Kyle. So once this book, I mean, are you writing another book as we speak?
So Honor Lost was originally 2 books. Remember, I said it was 230,000 words. I found out when I went to try publishing it that I found out that most publishers only want about 120,000 words for a manuscript. Yeah. So I was like, oh, well, this works. I can cut this book in half, part 1 and part 2, and both of those end up being around 110,000 words or so. So I cut it in half. So part 1 became Honor Lost. I published it. So part 2 has already gone through a little bit of editing. It's completely written. I would need to go back and do some of the same tweaks that I did with the first book, making sure that locations line up with each other. I would have to, change again the way the Unveski look. I also changed some of the weapons and armament of even the main group of mercenaries, who by book 2, spoiler, are adventurers now, because my concept for the story as a whole was to take a group of mercenaries and have them go through a process of life where they do become rebels against the Unveski. That is the ultimate endpoint. But I don't think that it's not like in some TV shows where, they're just normal people, one bad thing happens to them, and the next thing you know, they're leading a revolution. It's like, no, look at our own revolutionary leaders, look at revolutionary leaders in other places throughout history, and usually there's a journey. You don't just kind of wake up one day and go, I'm probably going to die, because it's hard enough to fight a rebellion. It's even much, much harder to start a rebellion. And that's the process that I have this group go from, is a group of normal mercenary soldiers, if you can call mercenary soldiers normal to begin with. They go from a group of normal mercenary soldiers to adventurers to rebels.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the process that I'll be taking them through. If my books, I'm using Honor Lost as a kind of a test run to see how well it'll do.
Mm-hmm. So will it be Honor Lost 2, or will you have a different name?
The working titles that I have in my head are Honor Lost, Honor Found, and Honor's Stand. I like Honor's Stand.
Uh-huh.
I'm a little more iffy on Honor Found, because originally in my head, when I thought of Honor's Lost, I was thinking it was going to be a 2-book thing. Honor Lost, and then Honor's Stand.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't anticipate originally having to split the books, the first book up into 2. So right now in my head and on my computer, the running title for book 2 is Honor Found, but I don't know. I'm a little bit less confident. I'm pretty confident that I've written good stories. So Honor Lost, I think, is a good story. I've shown it to a lot of my friends, and soldiers take a particular sadistic delight in insulting each other. Guys in general do this anyway. If you listen to a group of guys talk to each other versus how women talk to each other, guys, as a general rule, are already brutally honest to each other. Yeah. Soldiers dial that up even more so. So I've shown this novel to any nerd I could find within my peer group, and they all like it. That's what ultimately gave me the confidence to get this thing published anyway. It's like, well, if it wasn't a good story, I have to believe at least one of my friends would have been like, dude, Kyle, this thing sucks. Why'd you waste my time giving it to me? But that hasn't happened. No, I've shown it to a few family members who weren't even in my target audience group, and they liked it. So I'm confident in my writing abilities. I'm confident in my storytelling abilities. I'm not so confident in my title creating abilities. Mm-hmm. I don't particularly like the title Honor Lost. I don't really like the title Honor Found. Maybe I'm being too critical on myself, but yeah, that's the copy going right now.
Mm-hmm. I like the title Honor Lost.
Okay, I mean, well,
it's a refreshing title, and so I really like the title of the book, and it's so interesting and so well written. I love how descriptive you are. That one bar scene. It's so interesting what you do with the characters and what you make them do. And then all of a sudden, the dog that you talked about in the morning, who is just such a nice, lovely companion to her master,
is right there in the middle of the fight as well.
And as long as the master's not fighting, the dog's happy just to be happy. And run around the bar, but as soon as a fight breaks out, and if the master's in it, well, she's right there.
That was the dog's cue to like, oh, okay, we're doing this now. Yep, it was a well-trained dog.
Yeah, and it's a lot of people wouldn't have thought of that, and that's what I liked. You brought that dog back in there that I wasn't expecting you to do, and so I really like that. You're a fine writer.
Well, thank you.
So you won an award already for this book. You want to talk about that? The Plume Award.
Yeah, Writers Republic, when they get their books, when they get their new manuscripts together, and then for their round of publishing, they select one that they think is really outstanding, and they give it that Plume Award. And yeah, they nominated mine.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. So when we talk about the second book that you're working on right now, how does it differ from the first one?
Well,
or is it a progression?
It's a progression, which means it is different. So I hate stories that take place over a long period of time when I'm writing, when I'm watching shows and characters don't progress. So in my story, there are going to be characters who die. There's going to be new characters get introduced.
I love that.
Life happens.
Mm-hmm.
And they go from, in the first story, they're mercenaries. Things happen to pretty much end that career by the 2/3 of the way point of book 1. by book 2, the book 2 begins with a whole new adventure, and it's also inspired by what I see happen all the time with Army buddies when I keep track of them on social media. Is a lot of times soldiers do keep track of each other after the military, and sometimes if one ends up doing something fun, they'll bring their band back together again and say, hey, let's go do this thing now. Hell, look at the guys who did Black Rifle Company, Black Rifle Coffee Company.
Yes.
That's exactly it. They were a group of soldiers. A couple of them had served together, and then afterwards they decided to do this thing, and then they started bringing in all their buddies, and that kind of thing happens quite a bit. So that's what inspired me. So book 2, Owen discovers a treasure. He wants to go after it. He rounds up his buddies, and they go and they become treasure hunters. And that book was more, that part of the book was more inspired just by like good old adventure stories. No high end politics, no overtly moral lessons. No, it's just a group of former soldiers getting together trying to get rich. But in the process, because they are in a land where the underlying everything that happens in book 1 and book 2, and it'll be a big part in book 3, there is a strong cultural tension. I don't want to say racial tension because that brings up a whole new nuance. But in the same way that think like the Saxons and the Normans, when the Normans conquered England from the Saxons in the 1100s, and there was a lot of friction between those two groups for at least a couple hundred years. Same thing like when the English conquered Ireland, the way they treated the Irish. So when I say cultural tensions, it's along those lines. And the main group of mercenaries, they belong to the conquered group. So while they're running around the land just trying to get rich, they are having to tiptoe around Untvesky authorities. They're having to witness the brutality of their people in a little bit more visceral way than they kind of had to, because soldiers, as a general rule, at least in my personal experience, are a little bit more removed from the rest of the population. We kind of do our own thing. It's an entirely different subculture.
Oh yes.
And so they don't see as much of that. They don't have to stomach nearly. They're a little bit more privileged in the first book because they are elite mercenaries. Whereas in book 2, they're in amongst the population and they're dealing with that.
Well, I mean, when you go into the military, you're shaped, right? Is that the word?
Yeah, you could use that. A really blunt way.
Go ahead.
I don't like the word
groomed
either.
No.
Conditioned, I think is the word.
Okay.
Conditioned. There's definitely a mentality that if you didn't have it already going to the military, basic training enforces it. Training in your unit afterwards definitely enforces it. Deployments definitely affect that conditioning. So, and it's the kind of conditioning that, where how many stories have you heard where a knifing attack happens on a train or something like that in Europe, and a couple of soldiers who happen to be on the train, whereas everybody else is backing off away from it, or even worse, pulling out their cameras to record it. A couple of soldiers on the train go into action and attack the criminal. So that mindset of, instead of running away from the danger, running to confront the danger, there's that conditioning. And that's part of the reason I knew I wanted to tell the story of a rebellion against an evil empire. To me, the most logical group to do that, the most logical type of people to do that, would be military. And I mean, historically, a lot of the people who do start rebellions I mean, hell, a lot of civil wars, a lot of revolutions, it actually is top ranking military members who begin that kind of a thing. Every now and then you get people who weren't, like, I mean, look at, the famous revolutionary Che Guevara. The guy was a doctor before he became a revolutionary. But there are plenty of other, look at our founding fathers. Some of them were military, some of them were politicians, and so forth. So for my story, I decided to go with a group of mercenaries, because I kind of stuck with, well, I can identify with soldiers. I know how soldiers think. I know how we talk, how we act. I thought it'd be fun because I see how soldiers are portrayed in fiction, on TV, and in books. And generally, when Hollywood civilians portray military members, they do it in the most cringy, stereotyped way possible, i.e. the Bad Batch, Star Wars, the Bad Batch. It's not a terrible show, but the characters of the Bad Batch, it is the cookie cutter stereotype. Every single one of member of the Bad Batch, like, oh, the big dumb guy who's good with explosives. Oh, the thin, sinister guy with the whispery voice who's also the sniper. The thin, balding guy with glasses called Tech. He's their technical guy. Yep. It's like, you guys didn't even try on this. So I was like, okay, I need to do my own stories. Okay, here's what soldiers are like.
Yes. And so in addition to, I mean, when we talk about conditioning, I think, the general public think conditioning, they're putting you through your paces. You have to do a lot of obstacles and stuff like that. But talk to us about, your your mind is also being conditioned because you're being deployed,
well, sure.
Right? So there's also that.
Sure. It just kind of goes back to the stories that you hear every now and then on soldiers on a train being conditioned to, okay, never mind the danger. This is a thing that needs to happen. There's innocent people being harmed. I'm going to do something about it. And you just kind of have to push the danger of the risk. You have to kind of push that aside. And that's another reason why I chose mercenaries and for mercenary soldiers. The fact that the mercenaries is just kind of an add-on thing. It's actually not that big of a deal that they're mercenaries, and that's another reason why I chose mercenaries. Honestly, is I know a lot of people in the civilian world, when you hear the word mercenary, there always seems to be this weird negative connotation to the word. I don't see that as, okay, a mercenary. All a mercenary is a professional soldier who I think this is actually the UN definition basically of mercenary is somebody who goes and fights in a conflict whose host nation is not involved. So that's why you see when those Blackwater guys and so that were in Iraq, well, it was an American company and it was predominantly ex-special forces types who were fighting and who were being recruited into Blackwater. So they are private contractors, not mercenaries. Now, if Blackwater had gone into like what's going on now in Ukraine, okay, now they'd probably be considered mercenaries. But okay, is that a bad thing? I don't see that as a bad thing. I think it just depends on who they're working for. They're just, it's a professional soldier. So yeah, I wanted people I wanted to focus on a story who already have the mindset of being willing to step up in the face of danger. Soldiers, I think most soldiers, especially combat soldiers, you have to lose a little of that fear of death. Like so many civilians are terrified even of, oh my God. I see civilians like when I'm in a college classroom like that, and they're terrified of even hurting somebody's feelings, or they're terrified of getting dislikes on social media.
Well, and
that stops them.
Yeah, and some people, if there's nothing to worry about, they make up stuff to worry about. I mean, because we're not, as humans, we're not really being challenged at a very high level. And so when we have an ordinary life where we go to work, come home, eat dinner, watch television until it's bedtime and go to sleep. There's lots of idle time to think about what to worry about. And a lot of people spend time doing that. And I feel so bad for people like that. They haven't learned a different way. Maybe they'll hear this podcast and say, oh, goodness, I do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just a indication of how truly good we actually have it in the world right now. It's a whole, I love the phrase, hard times create tough men create good times create weak men create hard times.
Okay.
And it's just a cycle.
It's a cycle. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And
you're listening to the Rhonda Grant Show right now, whose podcast has been treated with digital audio health by my sponsor, Simatrax. And today I am speaking to an award-winning author, Jason Kyle, and his first book, Honor Lost. Let our audience know how they may purchase your book, Jason.
Well, you can get it very easily by typing in Honor Lost by Jason Kyle on Amazon. You can get it from the Writers Republic website. You can also get it from Barnes and Noble's website. It's available digitally or on paperback from any of those three sites.
And then you have a part 2 coming up as well.
I have a part 2 locked and loaded on standby.
Nice.
Kind of waiting to see how this one does.
Uh-huh.
If it does well enough to if it looks like people are interested, yes, I have a book too that, oh man, give me a few months of editing and giving it the makeover treatment. I like adding illustrations to the story, especially for fantasy fiction. So give me a little bit of time to generate some illustrations and whatnot. Yeah, I could, within a few months, as soon as I decide to, I could have book 2 released. I even have the 3rd book actually started. I already have a very in-depth outline. I know where I'm going with my story.
Your book is very interesting. It's incredibly descriptive and it's fast moving. And that's what people like. I mean, it's a perfect combination for a really great read. Tell me, do you feel that you've been called to your journey that you're on right now?
No, I think I just, like a lot of writers that I've read when they're interviewed, I just decided I wanted to write this kind of story that I like to read. And I don't see a whole lot of military focused fantasy fiction. And I had the material to work with. I had the inspiration, I've deployed to Iraq 3 times. So that combined with being a huge fantasy fiction nerd, I decided to try my hand at it.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like to arrive in those countries and know that you're in war?
The first time it was definitely exciting because I arrived in country in March 2003. So I was pretty excited because I was very aware that I was helping make history, at least in my own teeny tiny little way. So I was pretty excited. The second time I was a little bit less excited because the second time, in fact, I got the drunkest I've ever been in my life the night before. And I flew to Iraq with a massive hangover. Because by the second time I deployed in the winter of 2007, like November, December 2007, the war had transitioned to an insurgency where the enemy were predominantly using IEDs, and I was going to be a gunner, which is the position most likely to get hit by IEDs because you're more exposed.
Right.
Then by my 3rd deployment towards the end, it was to Kirkuk, Iraq in 2010. Yeah. And I wasn't as worried because we already knew that we weren't going to be going on missions outside the wire almost ever. So, I mean, the enemy was still nice enough to lob improvised mortars over the fence at us on at least a weekly basis, just to let us know they still cared about us.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'd be in the middle of playing StarCraft in my chew, and I'd hear, burr, 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 warning, incoming. And the first few times it happened, I did what we're all briefed to do: run outside, find a concrete bunker, hide, wait for the impact sound. And then one day I was coming back from chow after an incoming alert, and it hit right on top of somebody's CHU, which is a compartmentalized housing unit or something like that. It's basically a metal shed made to be living quarters for soldiers.
Right.
And a mortar shell had landed right on somebody's CHU, right on their bed, in fact.
Oh, shoot.
And I was just like, you know what? These mortars, they're so random. If there's a mortar out there with my name on it, hiding isn't going to help me. And a lot of soldiers do get that. That goes back to what I said earlier in the interview of, so we start developing a kind of not so much lack of fear, a comfortableness with the idea of death.
Okay.
So I know from talking to other soldiers and from also reading a little bit on psychology, I know my attitude isn't abnormal for soldiers. And that's like, you know what?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to bother hiding. I'm not going to react, because if there's a mortar out there with my name on it, nothing I can do is going to stop it. So there's no point in worrying about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of felt that. And I actually I had that same attitude. I started getting that same attitude in my second deployment with IEDs, where one of the first things I do when we got in country is we got a big in-depth briefing where they're laying out all these different IEDs on tables, going, here's what the enemy are making, and I'm looking at all the clever ways they're hiding these things, these IEDs. It's like, oh yeah, you're supposed to be look for the telltale wires and all that stuff. I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna spot a wire the size of, a phone cord while I'm bouncing up and down on a bumpy road in a turret going 50 miles an hour. No, if there's an IED out there with my name on it, it's gonna get me. I'm not gonna spot the stupid thing. So all I'm gonna do is, while I'm up on that turret, I'm gonna scan my sector. And if I see a bad guy who's so bad at his job that he lets me see him, and I can tell that he's a trigger man, okay, I'll kill him.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to see the IED that kills me. So there's no point in constantly stressing over that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get it for sure. What extraordinary discovery have you found in your life, or have you?
Well, shoot. Maybe that's it. Don't sweat little stuff.
Yeah.
Don't worry about death, because death happens to everybody at some point. You don't know when it's going to happen. If you live your whole life worrying about, oh no, I might cross the street and get killed, so I better not do this. Oh no, this new type of flu or something might kill me, so I better, hide and lock myself in my house 24/7.
Yeah, geez, Jason, I had goosebumps how profound is that? I had goosebumps from you describing that. And that's true. I mean, we are going to all die.
Yeah,
and we live in so much fear while we're alive.
Worrying about it. When it happens, it's going to happen. You're probably not going to, you can plan for it all you want, make a will, sure. But there's no point in sweating about it, because chances are you're not going to know it happens until it happens. So every time I took my son into bed at night, I tell him I love him. Every time I send him off to school, I tell him I love him.
Yeah.
And I've made him aware his whole life, because we've talked about, he's seen a couple of pets die at this point. I teach my son, death happens. It's a thing. Someday we will say our last goodbye. Maybe it'll be me that goes first. It should be. It better be me that goes first. So someday he should be prepared. Hey, guess what? Someday grandma and grandpa are going to die. Someday I'm going to die. Enjoy the people you have while you have them. There's no point in sweating there's no point in ruining your life worrying about when it happens. And that's
great philosophy.
Fantastic.
So do you think your son will go into the military? Would you advise him?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't advise it. If he were to go in the military, I would tell him go officer. If you're going to be a soldier, you may as well be a well-paid soldier.
Right.
And no, the way the U.S. Army is right now, no, I'm afraid I wouldn't actually advise it. And I know a lot of peers who would say the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, we always want more. We always want better for our children than what we've had. And so that's really good advice. Thank you very much for being on the Rhonda Grant Show. I've really enjoyed our time together, and I've enjoyed our discussions up until now. And so I look forward to interviewing you when your next book comes out. And who knows, it might be before Christmas so that people can buy it who have already bought Honor Lost for friends of theirs, right?
Well, so Honor Lost came out just after Christmas of 2022.
Mm-hmm.
I would say I'll give it, I want to give it at least this full year to see how it does.
Okay, right.
If it does well enough to justify the expense, I could see pulling the trigger on that and getting the ball going to get the next one spun up next year.
I see.
If it does well. So please, everybody, buy my book.
Yes.
Give me a reason to publish the next one and the next one.
Exactly. So Jason Kyle, you will not be disappointed. Honor Lost is his first book. It's already award winner. And I advise you to get onto Amazon and get your copy. Thank you very much for being on the show, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you. Had a good time.
Theme song for the Rhonda Grant Show is Sun on the Water, composed and performed by my friend John Park Wheeler. This is Rhonda Grant with the Rhonda Grant Show, author of Magical Forces Within, Extraordinary Discoveries in an Ordinary Life, inviting you to look for the magical forces within yourself today and every day.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rhonda Grant Show with your host, Rhonda Grant. If you would like to find out more information about Rhonda and her upcoming guests and the work that she does, go to her website, rhondagrantauthor.com. That's rhondagrantauthor.com.
Digital Audio Health by Cymatrax.